Bernstein, and today is Monday, October 11th, 2004. The Jewish community in America is celebrating 350 years of Jewish life, and we are privileged to be talking with Tom Schneider, who is going to share his Jewish experience with us. And I'm going to jump right in, Tom. Your name is Tom Schneider. Is there more to your name? Do you have a Hebrew name?
There's always more to the name because it reflects so much of our history.
Go ahead.
And family. But because while my name is Schneider, it's not really the family name. We're not really sure what the family name was. I can talk about how grandparents came over to this country and took on names.
Go ahead.
My name is Thomas P. Schneider, and I was born and raised in Wisconsin Rapids. But obviously the family goes back a lot further than that.
Tell us about it, and tell us what Schneider means.
Well, I'll start with my great-grandfather.
Okay.
On my mother's side.
Okay.
His name was Alvin Garber, and he was born and raised in Grishkovka, Russia, and in about 1879. But by 1913, of course, there were waves of immigrants, particularly Jewish immigrants, fleeing both poverty and pogroms in Eastern Europe. And he came to this country in 1913 at the age of 33, looking for a better life. And very shortly after that, he came to Arpin, Wisconsin, a small town in central Wisconsin. He had a relative there, and there was a Jewish farming community that had started in about 1906, 1904, right in that area, with 18 families, mostly from Milwaukee, supported by the Jewish Agricultural Aid Society of Milwaukee. And so that small Jewish farming community in Arpin was where he settled to create a better life. And of course, life was not easy in Arpin, Wisconsin. The community lasted for only, I would say, a little less than maybe 2 decades. But he was able to ultimately stay in the area. By about 1924, the community had broken up. People had gone back to Milwaukee, but he stayed in Wisconsin Rapids, where he was a rag collector. But he also was a cantor and had been trained as a cantor. And although there wasn't much of a Jewish community in central Wisconsin, there was ultimately a synagogue in Stevens Point, not too far. And he was a cantor there, and then much later in San Diego, and ultimately back in Milwaukee. But having lived in Wisconsin Rapids and finally earned enough money to send for his wife, and by that time his granddaughter and their family, they came to this country and joined them in Wisconsin Rapids. And by that time my mother, Gloria Bocaner, was 3 years old. So his wife came, and his daughter, Jenny, who had then married Bocaner, came. And their daughter, my mother, at the age of 3, all came to Wisconsin Rapids. And that's how there came to be a bit of a Jewish community in Wisconsin Rapids, where I was born and raised. At the same time that was going on, in about 1904, my grandfather on my father's side fled what was at that point Volkovisk, which is sometimes Russia, sometimes Poland, sometimes Lithuania, to avoid being inducted into the Russian army, which wasn't a very good place for Jews to be at that point in time. Fled to Germany for about a year, and then came to America. His trade was he was an apprentice shoe repairman, or a cutter, which in German was Schneider. And so while we're not exactly sure what his name was before that, we think it was Longberg or Longboard or something like that. It became Schneider in this country, and he came to Milwaukee shortly thereafter. He met, actually he knew my grandmother from a nearby small town where he came from. They met in New York, married, and then came to Milwaukee and set up a small shoe repair shop on the south side of Milwaukee. I still remember visiting that small shoe repair shop in South KK in Milwaukee.
I want to ask you a question about the agricultural the Jewish Agricultural Society. Do you know anything about that? And what was it?
Well, it was funded in part through the Baron de Hirsch Society out of New York, in conjunction in Milwaukee with a shoe manufacturer by the name of A.W. Rich, who was very active in the Milwaukee Jewish community. Mm-hmm. And what they were dealing with is the anti-Semitism of Eastern Europe, and they were worried that these waves of Jewish immigrants would congregate in just a few big cities and again promote anti-Semitism as a reaction. So they created Jewish farming communities all throughout America and also through South America to disperse Jews throughout all communities in the country. And one of those communities in Wisconsin was the Jewish farming community in Arpin.
It was part of the, was that part of the industrial removal office? We had quite a bit of information where they tried to send people to Milwaukee. It was in one of our newsletters to try and disperse them and so on and so forth. Okay, so
my dad's father was here in Milwaukee, and he was raised here, born and raised in Milwaukee. Mm-hmm. The oldest of three sons, graduated from Tech High School when he was 16, went to work at the electric company, became president of the union at the electric company, and went to college at night at Marquette University where he graduated, and then went into World War II as an officer. In the meantime, at some point, he was introduced to my mother, who was a student at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, from Wisconsin Rapids. And ultimately, after he was out of the military, they moved to Wisconsin Rapids. My grandfather, by that time, the rag collecting business had evolved into a scrap metal business, and my father went into business with my grandfather, and it later became a wholesale plumbing, heating, and electrical supply business, which is a pretty common progression throughout America in the Jewish community. Interestingly enough, when I met my wife about 19 years ago, we were talking about our parents. And her father also had a wholesale plumbing and heating and electrical supply business in Connecticut. So it's not an unusual story. Mm-hmm. My mother, as I said, got her degree, and then they lived in Wisconsin Rapids, where I was born. They moved there just a few months before I was born, and they were both very active in the community, and I think their active community participation really, I think like so many parents, shaped their children and the values that they had.
How big a community was that, Tom?
At that time, Wisconsin Rapids was a community of about, I'd say, 10 to 12,000 people.
And the Jewish community?
We were about it.
That's right. Oh.
So,
how was that for you?
well, it was interesting because, and I guess I'll get into that in a little bit,
Okay.
but it was sort of by way of background. They were very actively involved and very much a part of the community. My dad had been very active politically. He'd been a delegate to many of the Democratic National Conventions and vice chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party, and had been part of a small group of people in the 40s and 50s who reorganized the modern-day Democratic Party. And our house, of course, in Wisconsin Rapids, since it's right in the center of the state, was a place where people would come and have meetings. So I grew up with Gaylord Nelson and Bill Proxmire and Pat Lucy and Jim Doyle Sr. all coming to meetings at our house to discuss what was going on. They, of course, ran for office and were elected. My dad was very content to run his business and be involved in the community in Wisconsin Rapids. He was also active on the Board of Visitors for the University of Wisconsin and active on the Vocational and Technical School Board, president of the Wisconsin Rapids Rotary. And he was at one point named Citizen of the Year by both the Rotary Club and the Labor Council in the same year. Mm-hmm. So we were, in one sense, very much a part of the community. Mm-hmm. The same was true as my mother. In the early 50s, my mom and a small group of others took out the very first ad in the country. She was head of a group called Citizens versus McCarthy, challenging publicly Joe McCarthy, which received, you can understand, national attention. It was an amazingly courageous thing to do, not only for anyone anywhere in the country, but certainly coming from a small town in Wisconsin. But
Had she graduated from the University of Wisconsin?
Yes.
What was her degree?
Economics.
Outstanding.
But she ran, she was, during the part while I was growing up, she was a homemaker.
Uh-huh.
Took care of the house and the kids, but she was also active in the community, the League of Women Voters and the library board, and most of all, particularly in later years, she became one of Central Wisconsin's foremost clean air activists, which if you're dealing with Central Wisconsin and the paper mills, is also an interesting thing to be involved in Central Wisconsin, because Wisconsin Rapids was very much a paper mill town. There were 3 sons. I was the middle son and a daughter. And after we went off to college, she went back, got a teaching degree, taught history, and was president of her union, the Port Edwards High School. So you asked me what was it like growing up in Wisconsin Rapids. You know, it was really interesting because I had good friends. It was a safe and prosperous town. I was involved in sports and the debate team and drama and did well in school. But in other ways, it was very difficult. We were the only Jews in Wisconsin Rapids. The town was all white, Catholic and Protestant, and we knew we were Jewish, and everyone in town knew we were Jewish, but we had no Jewish education, and so we had no idea what that meant.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody knows you're Jewish, and you know you're Jewish, but you don't know what it means to be Jewish. So it's difficult for a kid dealing with the ignorance of anti-Semitism.
Did you experience
when the
it?
kid himself is ignorant about what Judaism
Right,
is?
right. Did you experience anti-Semitism?
Absolutely.
A lot of it?
I wouldn't say a lot of it, but it was never that far from the surface, both overtly and expressed, and sometimes more subtly. Yeah.
I do have a question right about now, and maybe you're going to get into this. But did you go to other communities for high holidays? Did you?
No.
Nothing.
Right.
Nothing at all.
Right.
Okay.
1965, I went to the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And by 1968, several friends and I organized the campus Liberal Party at Madison. And I was elected vice president of the Student Association and later chairman of the board of the National Student Association. And we were dealing with the issues of that time, anti-war in Vietnam, civil rights, women's rights. By 72, I graduated from the UW Law School, and I wanted to be a trial lawyer. So I had the good fortune to become an assistant district attorney in the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office. Back to my dad's hometown in Milwaukee. Joined the DA's office as an assistant DA, and then I was head of the organized crime unit and the white collar crime unit. Did a lot of felony cases, and then became the deputy district attorney for Milwaukee, in charge of all felony prosecutions in Milwaukee. Headed the Metropolitan Drug Enforcement Group. Got involved in a lot of things, both through work and extracurricular in the community. And then in 1993, I was appointed by President Clinton to serve as the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of Wisconsin.
How did that happen? Did you know him?
I didn't know President Clinton, no, although I had been very active and still am active in political life in Milwaukee, as well as community activities. I had helped run numerous campaigns since 1972 up to that time throughout the area, both locally and statewide. And as the deputy DA, it wasn't that unusual because of my experience to go from being the senior deputy DA in the district attorney's office, handling all felony prosecutions, to becoming the U.S. attorney handling all federal cases in the eastern half of the state of Wisconsin.
And Tom, I'm curious to know about how, if Judaism had any impact on your life once you got to Madison or to Milwaukee, in that whole, because you felt anti-Semitism, didn't know what being Jewish really meant. Did that change at all when you went to Madison?
Not in Madison. although it's interesting, the people that I was involved with in civil rights and women's rights and anti-Vietnam War activities, although none of us ever talked about religion, it turns out all of us were Jewish, and many of us are still friends to this day. But when I came to Milwaukee, after a few years, I began to get involved with the Jewish community. Initially, through the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. I was invited to a young leadership event and then participated in young leadership activities and ultimately became chair of the young leadership program. And at the same time, began just sitting in the back at Congregation Emmanuel. I asked the rabbi if I could sort of come and watch for a while. And
Observe.
And I would regularly show up and observe. It's interesting, growing up, I knew so much about other religions, because if you're growing up in Wisconsin Rapids and you have friends, you're in the Congregational Boy Scout troop, and you're at Catholic services with friends, and your Methodist services with friends, but I sort of wanted to know more about me and my own identity before I chose what I felt was the best course. And so while in many ways I'm of course Jewish by birth, but in other ways I'm very much a Jew by choice. And so I got involved in that direction. And then I had the tremendous good fortune, having been involved through the Federation Young Leadership and by this time on the board of the Milwaukee Jewish Council, to be invited to interview to study through the Wexner Heritage Foundation. And I did my interview, and I was lucky enough to be selected. I think there were 16 or 17 of us, every other week for 4 hours for 2 years, including weekend retreats and 2 weeks in Israel, and really an intense crash course on Jewish history, Jewish ethics, Torah, Talmud, an amazing experience with some incredible teachers. And that really was important to me, because they were looking for people at that time that they felt, for whatever reason, were roughly 25 to 40 back then, and were beginning to move into positions of Jewish leadership, but needed to know more about their own sense of identity and Judaism.
Was that before or after you won the Nickel Award?
That was definitely before.
Uh-huh.
And that really gave me some sense of self-confidence to be able to go ahead and then become president of the Milwaukee Jewish Council for Community Relations and president of the Wisconsin Jewish Conference and head of agency relations for the Milwaukee Jewish Federation. Because it really involved then, particularly the job of head of agency relations for the Jewish Federation, knowing really the intimate details of the community. Because when you're making decisions about distributing funds to organizations, you can never know too much. And the needs are always greater than the resources that are available. And you're never making decisions between things that are good and bad. You're making decisions between things that are great and really great. And nobody's happy when you don't give them everything they need. And so you're making very difficult decisions, and it requires really knowing intimately what those organizations are about and what they do to the community. So having come from a place, Wisconsin Rapids, in which we had a strong sense of the community as a whole, but no sense of Jewish identity, you really can appreciate what it means to be a part of a Jewish community in Milwaukee. And while the organizations are not always living happily together, and there are disputes that go back and forth, the fact is that the whole is much greater than the sum of the parts. It's the concept of being in a community where there are schools, both day schools and congregational schools, and synagogues and federations and Jewish newspapers and Jewish family services and Jewish councils, and all of these things mixing together to create not just an individual organization, but a sense of Jewish community and what that does for the community. So, with the many years that I've been on the board and as an officer of the Federation, I think it's that background coming from a community that had no Jewish community and a family that had no Jewish identity that really influenced my appreciation for what it means to be in a community that has a Jewish identity and welcomes other people into it. I also was fortunate enough to meet my wife, Susan Stein, who was raised in Waterbury, Connecticut, but lived in New York City for many years, and she was in Milwaukee on business at a company that she was the associate executive director of an organization, a national organization or international organization in New York called the New Israel Fund.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
And they were doing a national direct mail fundraising campaign, and of course she was dealing with a company in Milwaukee called AB Data, and the company was owned by friends of mine who introduced the two of us, and I guess they say the rest is, as they say, the rest is history. And we were married and
When
have
were you
two
married?
children.
When
we
were you
were
married?
in 1987.
That's the same year you got your Nickel Award, I think.
I don't remember what year it was,
I think
but
it was. That's what I wrote down.
By that time, I was very involved in the Jewish community, and she became involved in the community, was welcomed into the community, and spent 5 years as director of development for University School, and then associate director of the Boys and Girls Clubs, senior vice president of the Symphony, and now has her own business called Strategies for Philanthropy.
Right.
And we have two children, Rachel, who is 15 and a half, Daniel, who is 13, both at Shorewood High School and Shorewood Intermediate School.
Mm-hmm.
It won't surprise you to know that I think they're fabulous, wonderful kids.
Of course.
And
What kind of have you offered them a Jewish education of?
both
the
of them,
synagogue,
Rachel had her bat mitzvah, Daniel his bar mitzvah at Emmanuel, and both are avid walking, talking billboards for Camp JCC Interlaken, having that Jewish camp experience, and will develop for themselves their own sense of
BBYO?
not yet,
Not yet.
but that would be great.
Right. Doesn't work for everybody. Do you have more things?
No, if you have questions,
Marianne, do you have something you would like to ask?
I guess I'm curious to know what I'm getting into the Jewish aspect of your life, about Shorewood, living in Shorewood, and how your children relate to Judaism. Living in Shorewood, since we raised our children basically there, it was a small Jewish population at that time.
I guess it's all relative. A small Jewish population may be relative to Fox Point, but not compared to Wisconsin Rapids.
Yeah.
And they have friends who are both Jewish and non-Jewish. They have friends who are white and African American and Hispanic and Asian. In many ways, Shorewood is a diverse community, which tragically in Milwaukee is not that common. It was one of the things that we wanted them to have, is experience with a wide diversity of people, ethnically, religiously, economically.
Yes,
That's
as
the
a
way the
little
world is.
interjection, I drove past Lake Bluff School the other day, which is where my children went to grade school, and it was so diverse and ethnically diverse, and it was so dynamic and exciting. Parents were picking up their children of all nationalities at the time I passed the school, and I think it is a wonderful exposure.
You and I were talking before about the question of outreach on the part of, I said something about being involved in federation as opposed to being involved in synagogue life, and they're very different kinds of involvements. And you said, but they're the same, having to do with outreach. I wonder if if you could say something about that, your thinking on that issue.
Well, there's another aspect to outreach, which of course interests me a huge amount, since I'm deeply involved in it every single day. When I left the United States Attorney's Office at the end of the Clinton administration, I had several different opportunities to practice law, back as the deputy DA or in Washington or in a private firm. But as U.S. Attorney, I'd handled major gang cases and major drug cases and major civil rights cases. But I had also set up nationally the Model Federal Victim Witness Program and a national model for preventing crime, in part through outreach to youth organizations. And in that context, I had worked with just about every youth-serving organization in Milwaukee. And so it wasn't too surprising that I received a call from Children's Outing Association, COA Youth and Family Centers, asking if I would be interested in joining them as their executive director. I had to think about it, but number one, in working with those organizations, it was the one that I had consistently felt was one of the best. But number two, it was really an opportunity to reach, this year we'll reach well over 6,000 children and families, mostly from diverse backgrounds and low-income families and families in the central city of Milwaukee. And it's the same model that served the Jewish community really so well. At the time when my great-grandfather and my grandfather on my father's side came to this country. COA was founded in 1906 and was part of an earlier organization called the Settlement, which was the Jewish community's answer to providing a wide range of services that would help lift immigrant Jews out of poverty into self-sufficiency. And one of the things that they wanted to do was provide a fresh air camp experience for kids who had no view of the world other than living in poverty. And so by creating Children's Outing Association, where kids could go to camp and have a healthy environment and some structure in their lives and see that there's more to life than just living in poverty, and give them some hope and some dreams and some opportunities. Literally for 98 years now, we've been sending kids to camp. I understand you were a camper.
No.
Who was I talking to just earlier? At Camp Sidney Cone. Must have been Tybee.
Might have been Tybee,
Yes.
right. I was not. But we will be interviewing two people in particular who had a Camp Sidney Cone experience that they're both dying to talk about.
Yeah.
So you remember that. You might want to use that.
So many people in the Jewish community, that's where they went to camp. That was their first experiences,
Right.
seeing the world outside of just living in the tenements. But literally by the 40s, of course, the community had changed. It wasn't just poor immigrant Jewish families.
Right.
There were African Americans and others, and the camp became the first integrated camp in the history of Wisconsin, serving people of all backgrounds and ethnicities. And of course, by the 50s and 60s, the Jewish community's drive for assimilation was being replaced by the Jewish community's drive for identity. And it wasn't enough just to have a camp for Jews. The Jewish community was looking for a Jewish camp. And so our camp director worked with the Jewish Community Center to establish Camp Interlochen,
Who was
Jack
it?
Weiner.
Oh, was he the camp director
Yes.
at Camp Sidney Cone?
And COA made a choice. The choice was, were we going to be a Jewish camp or were we going to be a camp serving low-income families?
Right.
And continue on with the basic mission of the settlement. And by the 60s, of course, the needs of the central city were greater than ever, and so it became the full settlement house with childcare and family and parenting services, after-school programs, camp, and adult education. Still very strong ties to the Jewish community. All of this began in 1906 at the exact same time that my great-grandfather Alvin Garber and my grandfather Harry
Sure.
Schneider
That's
were coming to America,
Sure.
and these were the services that really helped them succeed in the world, and it's the same services that are helping so many kids today.
What is the Jewish
succeed.
connection to COA now?
Mostly it's just so many individuals in the community who find this as a great way to become involved in the community as a whole. Not in conflict with their sense of Jewish identity, but really as an extension of Tikkun Olam and reaching out to the community and finding an effective way to make a difference in the community as a whole. So for example, our partnership with the National Council of Jewish Women in a program called HIPPY, Home Instruction for Parents of Preschool Youngsters, has just grown tremendously over the last few years. And that's only one of many examples where we have those ties. That was a program that was originally developed in Israel. So many of the people who were Camp Sidney Cone campers serve on our camp committee and help to direct what's now Camp Helen Brockman.
A
which is
Jewish,
200
old Jewish, German Jewish family.
Sure, and Helen Brockman, as many before her and since her, was a past president of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting that, unlike almost every other organization in town, COA was founded by women in the Jewish community. The boys created most of the other organizations, but most of those organizations didn't last.
Mm-hmm.
And the activism and hands-on involvement of those women, literally for the first 50 years, no men were allowed on the board of COA, and for the first 70 years, it was all women presidents. But even today, our board has a very hands-on, get-involved kind of a culture, which is very much derivative of what the Jewish community created in 1906.
That's very interesting. I have a question for you. I love what you said about the Jewish community, how you see it, your philosophy of it. What do you see for our Jewish community into the future? We're about to embark on a capital campaign, and so are other organizations in Milwaukee, Jewish organizations specifically, synagogues, different. But that's just one aspect of it. And thinking about, I think I'm looking for Tom Schneider's take on the next 10 or 15, 20 years. What do you think, what do you see down the pike?
There are lots of different identities, not necessarily competing or conflicting.
Mm-hmm.
None of us are so simple as to have a single sense of identity. There's a sense of community identity. I mean, the entire Milwaukee community or the nation or the world. And then there's a sense of Jewish identity. I am a Jew and I am a part of the Jewish community. And then there's a sense of self. And I suppose out of all of that, maybe this is way too philosophical, comes a sense of purpose that maybe gives us a sense of meaning. One of the things I worry about is we all know that if the Jewish community doesn't care about its own community, who else is going to? And so it's important for us to have that strong sense of Jewish community. And I think we have that here in Milwaukee. But I worry that in some ways we've become too introspective. It's important for us to build a strong Jewish community, but never forget that we're part of the big world, and that the community doesn't necessarily have to be divided by ethnicities and by religions and by races. And in many ways, that introspection of the Jewish community has, in my view, seen a little bit of lessening of reaching out to the community as a whole. And it concerns me. And as the Jewish community has become much more prosperous, we talk every Passover about caring for the widow and the orphan and those who are in need, because we remember that we were strangers. We remember that we were slaves. I'm not sure how clearly we remember anymore. And so I applaud the fact that maybe we're better at remembering than a lot of other communities that have become prosperous and forgotten where they came from altogether. I'm pleased that the Jewish community hasn't done that. We're always willing to reach out to those, for example, through the Federation in the former Soviet Union, or what's going on in Argentina, or refugees everywhere. And that's one of the things that I think is very important to this community, but also to remember that if we isolate ourselves from the rest of the world, we forget the lessons of history. And so it's important for us to be a part of the community and take a lead with the rest of the community and let people know how much we truly do care about those around us of all shapes, sizes, colors, stripes, religions, ethnicities, who have needs. It's part of what defines us as a Jewish community.
do you think that some of that is met through agencies such as American Jewish Committee and the Milwaukee Jewish Council, or do you think that we need to do more? Should the Federation be taking a role in this in some way? I'm interested in what you see as, are there action steps we should be taking, or are you being more philosophical and just making a bit of a warning or a worry?
Neither. I think that each individual will decide for themselves how much they want to devote to strictly themselves, how many want to devote to the Jewish community, themselves and others within the community, and how much they want to devote to the community at large. And I'm glad that there are organizations within the Jewish community who can do all of those things and give us an opportunity to participate in a lot of different ways. I don't have a specific call to action here, but I know that it's important for us to provide all those avenues for involvement, and ultimately then all of those involvements help to define who we are as a people and who each of us is as an individual.
Do you, if there were something that is there something that you could say to me or to our audience? I think we should have an organization that does this or that. Is there something that we're lacking? Just not necessarily what we were just discussing, but in general, do you see something lacking in this community? Do you think that there might be agencies that have outlived their Jewish usefulness, or usefulness as a Jewish organization, whatever? And I'm not asking you to name anything. I'm just asking you a question in general.
In 2 hours or less.
Yes. I think you know what I'm...
Well, organizations are always changing.
Mm-hmm.
And the worst thing that can happen to an organization is that it stands still because everything around them is moving.
Mm-hmm.
They say you can never put your foot in the same river twice.
Mm-hmm.
It's important that the community be dynamic and recognize that. But I think it's also, we have a very strong Jewish community here with a lot of different ways that people can be involved. And as long as we keep encouraging people to be involved, not to withdraw into themselves, not to separate themselves from the community, but to let them know that they really can make a difference in the Jewish community and in the community as a whole, and that'll have a profound impact on themselves and their children and their families, then we're in pretty good hands.
Speaking of that, we have an election coming up, and I know you've been very involved your whole life, as you've told us. Would you have any words?
No.
Well, yes, you have lots of words, and I'd like you to express them if you don't mind putting it on tape.
Well, I've been involved in lots of political campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
Values are learned
Mm-hmm.
and are always changing and growing, but at the same time, my parents and those before them were deeply involved in the community and in Democratic Party politics, as have I been, and I still am. I served as state finance chair for the Kerry campaign this year,
Mm-hmm.
and was active in the campaigns of President Clinton and many U.S. Senate races for Herb Kohl, and local races for state senators and state assemblymen and for judges. I just think it's important for people to take their values and their beliefs and not to retreat into their homes and just worry about, what's the latest model car I want to buy, and, I really need this new whatever it is, you fill in the blank. And I don't begrudge people who are successful. I think it's wonderful. I think success is also very much related to people's business and their family life. But I think people who are involved in the community, Jewish community as a whole, really bring from that a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of accomplishment.
Yes, I guess, of course, I agree with you. And in fact, I think that being successful in what you do enables you more easily to participate in the community if you're taught the right values from the start, which obviously you have been from your family. You have, sounds like an outstanding background. Are your either parent alive or?
My mother's still alive.
Is she? And
Yes.
in
Moscow, Idaho, living with my sister.
Really?
But you know what you said reminds me of a time I was coming out of a soccer game with my son, Eline, and we had to grab something very quick to eat before he went to the next event he was going to. And so we ducked in next door to the Kmart, and we were walking down the aisle, brightly lit Kmart aisles, other people shopping at the same time. And he must have been 7 or 8 or 9 years old at the time. And out of nowhere, he looks up and says, "Dad, do we believe in an afterlife?" And it was like one of those E.F. Hutton commercials. Everything stopped. People around me stopped because they'd heard him say it. And everybody is listening. And, you know, what do you say to your son or your daughter? And I don't know if I said the right thing or the wrong thing, but I said what came to mind, which was, as Jews, we don't know for sure that there's an afterlife. So we tend not to focus on the afterlife, but how we live our lives here. And do we do good things where we're living here and now? And
sounds good to me.
you know, I'm always slightly amused or interested when people have this concept of intention versus actions.
Mm-hmm.
I think there are a lot of well-intentioned people out there
Mm-hmm.
who never get up the energy to actually do something about it. And I think one of the great strengths we have as a Jewish people is we don't sort of measure people by what their best intentions were, but by what their deeds were. And we encourage people to do things and to be involved. And of course, the Federation is a fabulous avenue for people to be involved and to make a difference.
I agree, of course. Was there something that you wanted to bring up that you haven't, Tom? I mean, this was like such an easy interview. I just want to ask you one thing. Other than your wife and your children, what are you most proud of as far in your life? Is there some one thing? I don't care if it's learning to play the clarinet.
No, it's pretty hard after you can't say other than my wife and my children because those are so far at the top.
Of course, but we
And,
assume we at the Jewish Historical Society assume that all people are most proud of their spouses and their children. Somebody told me this morning it was creating a new business out of nothing, and I just wondered if there was something that you've done or accomplished that you know, you say to yourself, gee, I really am proud of that. Or I'm sure you have so many accomplishments that you're probably proud of all of them, and rightfully so.
I'd have to think about that for a while.
Well, we don't have a for a while, so there you go.
So I'll take a pass on that one.
All right, okay. Then let me ask you one of our last questions on our list of questions, and you know what they all are. How would you like to be remembered? Remember, this will be viewed even 25, 50 years from now. How would you like the audience or the viewer of this to remember Tom Schneider?
I don't know. Obviously, people who will remember me, I hope, are my children and their children.
Mm-hmm.
Above and beyond that, I don't know how much it matters that people remember who I am or was, but what I did. They'll look at civil rights cases that stopped redlining in Milwaukee, or that created the National Model Federal Victim Witness Program to help victims of crime, or that look at, they won't know that I was involved necessarily at COA Youth and Family Centers, but 50 years from now, I guarantee you there will be kids who will be talking about their experiences and how it changed their life at Camp Helen Brockman, or participating in programs, just like there's so many in the Jewish community who talk about Camp Sidney Cone and know how that deeply affected their life. So I don't know that it matters to me a whole lot they remember me, but I take considerable comfort and pride in knowing that it will have hopefully made a real difference to people in the community.
Hear, hear.
Thanks, Tom.
That was excellent.
Nice.
Wonderful.
That's
Oh.
it. You know, people ask us how we're going to use this material. And as I'm sitting and listening to